God calls once again, and this time to a latency-aged lad named Samuel. This is the precursor to the creation of a formidable prophet. This child, so badly desired by his mother Hannah, that she vowed to give him up to the temple if only she could have a child. Hannah kept to her word, and after God granted her a son, and following a lengthy time of weaning, she sent him to be raised by Eli, the priest at the house of the Lord in Shiloh. Eli worked long and hard there for about 40 years. Then it was time to find a successor. When Samuel hears his name, he obediently went to Eli. "Go back to sleep, child," said Eli twice. Then, finally, Eli understands that God was once again providing direct revelation. There is bravery in this story. Eli was brave to ask for the complete vision, not to mince words. He wanted to hear everything that God said to Samuel. And Samuel? Imagine having to tell the person who raised you that God was bitterly disappointed in him and his sons, and that punishment is forthcoming. They each must have respected and trusted the other implicitly. This is the type of relationship we can all desire. A trust in God and faith in the final outcome, no matter the intermediary posture which may bode poorly for ourselves or our families. God states that his works will cause those whose ears actually hear to tingle. Towards the end of this chapter, we do find out that the word of Samuel came to all of Israel. We know that God uses people, and God does not assume that all will hear. The tingling will only happen after the hearing. And who actually hears? Our minds are so chock-a-block full of stuff, activities, tasks with a quick turnaround due date, children to think about, rooms of stuff needing to be sorted, packed, and shipped, empty refrigerator shelves shouting us out the door to our favorite Ralphs, and bills staring us deeply in the face. Who has the time to listen? Who has the time to be present one to another? Who has the time to slow down and be? When should countries take time to listen to each other so as to finish a war from decades ago? In our story, God has to try, and try again to be heard. God calls out to Samuel's name at least 6 times. Eli has to send Samuel running back to bed 3 times before he finally gets it right. This leads to the assurance that we can try and work on our listening skills so that our ears can tingle with the words from our family, friends, co-workers, and co-worshipers. Maybe even tingle in a burning way from God. In the short Gospel of Mark, there are many instances of institutional boundary crossings. By the end of the first chapter, the writer of Mark already has Jesus involved in ministry. He's already teaching and healing. In the 3rd chapter, Jesus is ready for whatever comes at him. It is Sabbath. His disciples are picking heads of grain. The owner of the acreage was mandated by the Torah to leave the edges ready for harvest for the orphans, widows, and the hungry. The Pharisees were keeping their eyes on Jesus. He had already cultivated quite a following and was creating problems for the clerics, the professors of theology of the time. Let's remember what commandment that the Pharisees state Jesus is breaking in both these pericopes or stories. The 10 Commandments are found in Exodus 20, and this commandment is verse 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, this is really a good idea. The need for a day of rest, a day of holiness, a day without work for not just you and your family, but your slaves, the refugees, everyone all around. Everybody gets a day off, and every week. Then there is the Sabbath year, every seventh year, when people refrain from planting, sowing seed, or harvesting crops. Land went fallow. The land's year. The land had rest. There was a visible reminder that the land is not ours, but God's. Then, every seventh Sabbath year, every 49th year, is the year of Jubilee. All lands that were sold or confiscated were returned to their original owners, all debts canceled, all prisoners freed. Everything that we have is only on loan by God for our own good judgment about how to use it. We need a weekly part of our lives to let go and relax. That is the purpose of Sabbath, to have time to thank God for everything that we have, are, hope to be. So who would not concur with the Pharisees that Sabbath is vital? If it is good enough for God, it is obviously good enough for the human family. The Pharisees do have a right to question his behavior. We are seeing a change in the way to observe the law, after all. Jesus answers the religious authorities with a reminder from their own history, an illustration that if it was good enough for our tradition once, it can not be seen as a breach of the law, but as an indication of the best that happens to others, even on a holy day. How convenient that, as we previously considered the first book of Samuel, Jesus takes the Pharisees and each one of us back to a time when David was hungry. This part of the plot comes from 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. The background to this story is that King Saul wants to kill David, and David is running away to save his own life, and he needs food. He is alone. He lies to get what he needs and then carries on. The priest who helps him is killed later on with 85 other priests due to the actions of David. Listen to this short passage from 1 Samuel. David came to Nob to the priest Amalek. Amalek came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone? No one with you." David said to the priest Amalek, "The king has charged me with the matter and said to me, 'No one must know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now, then, what do you have at hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here." The priest answered David, "I have no ordinary bread at hand, only holy bread, provided that the young men have kept themselves from women." David answered the priest, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition, even today, when it is a common journey." So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence of the Lord, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. The word of our Lord. There are discrepancies in the way the writer of Mark had Jesus tell this illustration to the Pharisees. There is an error in the name of the priest. There is an error in that David was getting this bread for himself alone, but the choice was to use this as a teaching moment, and it worked. If a priest can give away the bread of the presence, the holy bread sanctified, then what harm does it do to take a few grains of wheat when people are hungry? Even in our book of order, the session is the ruling body given the order to define how to use the rest of our bread from our sacrament of communion. And here is what it says. At the conclusion of the service for the Lord's Day, the bread and cup are to be removed from the table and used or disposed of in a manner approved by the session, in keeping the Reformed understanding of the sacraments and the principles of good stewardship. This may be accomplished by consuming what remains or returning the elements to the earth. You will find others, not of a Reformed denomination, who believe that only the priests may consume the bread and drink the juice or the wine. Our session allows us to give it to a member who would benefit by having bread. That occurred due to the deacons requesting that change from the session, as they saw people quite a few years ago who were hungry in our congregation. Or the session allows us to break it up and place it on the earth for God's creatures to enjoy. The Sabbath is to work for the good of the people, and not the people to create the Sabbath as an icon or godlike image. The second questioning seems even more severe. The man who was healed did not ask for anything from anyone. He was in the synagogue. He obeyed Jesus, who said, "Come over here." Matthew and Luke tell a similar time between Jesus, the man, and the Pharisees. In Matthew's account, Jesus throws in the idea of the importance of saving a sheep who has fallen into a pit on Sabbath, and that anyone would do that who was concerned about their livestock. Then he adds the zinger that a human is as worthy as a sheep, or perhaps even a little more so, and should be healed. Jesus, in essence, does not do any work in the healing. There is no operating table with sterile instruments, nurses, and anesthesia. No, all that occurs here is Jesus says, "Stretch out your hand." Is speaking not allowed on the Sabbath? Of course it is. But the healing is what makes the grumblers afraid, and they plan, work, scheme on how to destroy Jesus. Creating a plan to kill is hardly restful. Emotions would be running high, accusations made, defending the need to kill. Another commandment that is forbidden, do not murder. So who is shirking the Sabbath precept? Here is a fable to consider. A friend says to another friend, "If you had 2 houses, would you give 1 house to the poor?" The second friend said, "Yes, certainly I would." The first friend says, "If you had 2 cars, would you give 1 car to the poor?" "Absolutely, I would," says the friend. First friend, "If you had 2 boats, would you give 1 of your boats to the poor?" "No doubt about it." Finally, the first friend asks, "If you had 2 shirts, would you give 1 to the poor?" The second friend says, "No way, that would be ridiculous." Why? Because I have 2 shirts. It is easy to say we will give away what we don't have. The vow of poverty is a precept in Christianity. It is interpreted as declaring all material possessions are bad or evil. But King David, for instance, who we met on the run, became a very wealthy king and ruler and was very important to our faith. The problem is not with the things that we own per se, but the way we live our lives once we have them. How do we use them? How much time does it take out of our time of Sabbath rest to care for them? Everything that is a part of our lives requires time and energy. The invitation, the vow of poverty, is not an invitation to suffer deprivation, but rather to consider whether the things we own are really serving us or are we serving them. Jesus is telling us that human needs supersedes our personal possessions and institutional requirements. Jesus emoted in the Markan passage anger, disappointment, and sadness. The objects we own and the institutions that we elect do not always meet the needs of the people who are chosen by God. So as with Jesus and the Pharisees, transformation is needed. Grain may be picked on the Sabbath to feed the hungry. Our Messy church community is getting involved with feeding students at a nearby college who are homeless, hungry, and alone. We have found out, Jessica has found out, that there is a food pantry at Pierce Community College where we gathered and purchased food to deliver there. We also wrote a letter to each recipient of these bags of food saying, "Come over to our messy church service. We will feed you on each of these days. You can meet us and have fun, create, play, and if you want to participate, you may in a 16-minute worship service. Come and be fed with us around the table. Come and be included in the welcoming community of God. Come and be transformed here in this place. And while here in this place, may your ears tingle." Amen.